Well, Elizabeth Good, thank you so much for joining us today. So you are an advocate against sex trafficking. You have a book called Groomed. You've written about this. You're an expert on this subject. Before we get into that, though, I want to talk about maybe your interest in this. Where did that come from? Why is this a passion of yours?
You know what? I wasn't looking for it. I literally moved from Chicago to Florida to do nothing. That was the goal. But God, but quite honestly, my passion throughout my life, I'm in my 50s now. I received my master's in clinical psych in my late 20s. I was a mega church at Willow Creek and area pastor in my 30s. The root of everything that I've encountered, and I led post-abortive healing groups for years. And the root underneath everything was childhood sexual abuse. There were so many different symptoms. And so when I moved to Florida, I was put in this opportunity that we were raising money for something and sex trafficking came along. And the root was childhood sexual abuse there as well. So I think that the enemy comes in as children, like the quickest way to derail a destiny. And I know for myself, I was abused as a child. And the shame that comes upon a child and the confusion and the instant that everything happens differently, you don't see anything the same. And so I believe that that is my passion, is because I know how I was robbed and how many years it took to fight my way out of that. And we are passionate about getting ahead of it now, because trafficking is yet another symptom, just like abortion, domestic violence, they're all symptoms. But the root is what happens. Most children are abused between 3, 4, and 5 years old. And so we are passionate about interrupting their stories and getting ahead of it.
Yeah. I think so often we hear the big words, whether it's sex trafficking, and we do think, oh my goodness, that's such a huge topic. How could I ever even approach that? But like you said, there are a lot of root causes that precede this explosion of sex trafficking that's really sweeping our country, unfortunately. And you don't even think about that. You're living in the West, you're in the United States. We think we don't deal with sex trafficking, but other countries do. But the reality is that we're kind of an epicenter here in the United States for sex trafficking, as we've covered that a lot here at CBN News and at Faithwire. And pornography is an engine, it seems, that drives so much of that, particularly younger kids and teens who are introduced to pornography. Then they're desensitized to sexuality and all kinds of abuses. I know that's a lot there, but maybe could you explain a little bit of how pornography is directly tied to the sex trafficking issue?
Well, yeah, I love that you're asking this, and I'm so proud of you for speaking about it, because a lot of the church is like, we can't do that. We can't talk about porn. We can't go there. We can't. And you know what? Hell is systemically coming after our children, systemically dismantling the ability for intimacy, for family. Like, if we don't do something in 1 decade, everything will be different. And we have the power as the church to speak to it, because what I can tell you is from the last decade since I've run it, I've run safe houses. I ran them for over a decade. And when I started back in 2011, the average age that a little girl would post a naked selfie, which this will be shocking just from a decade ago, was 12. But now,
Wow.
the average age a little girl posts a naked selfie is 7 or 8 years old. And what is so horrific about this is that physically, biologically, they're not old enough to even be in that position. But what you're talking about, the grooming that's happening, the pornography, like we were all raised, my generation, on airbrushed Playboy. If you happen to see porn, it was an airbrushed Playboy on somebody's dad's toilet. And here, our children are given these devices that come preloaded to explicit. And what is on them is abusive. It is violent. It is everything but intimate. And so children are being exposed. What we're learning now from research. So here's what research tells us. The American Academy of Pediatrics says that 75% of 4-year-olds are given a smartphone. Most parents don't know. Like right now, there's a movie out, right? Puss in Boots by Disney. A child can say, "Show me Puss in Boots." And the imagery that will pop up with no filter will leave an imprint if it happens to be porn. If the wrong thing comes up, it's there. And then once it comes up once, it comes again and again. And what stats tell us is that children's neural pathways are being rewired because of what they're viewing by 7 to 8 years old. And so when they're viewing this stuff, their body is having responses that they're not chronologically old enough or biologically old enough to have. And just quite honestly, as a woman or as a man, when I nurse a baby, or if a person has an orgasm, there's oxytocin released. These children at 7 or 8 are having that chemical released in their bodies, but it's tied to everything wrong. Like it is unleashing things way out of order. Everything is out of order. And so there was just an incident, and this is why I do this, because I'm like, this is enough. The girls that end up in trafficking and safe houses, they just weren't caught along the way when all this stuff was happening. But a little girl was raped in a parking lot of a high school, 11-year-old, by a 17-year-old boy. And when they interviewed her, she said, it wasn't rape, he likes me. And it was a violent rape. Mm. And what they found out is she has been watching abusive porn since she was 5 years old. So they don't know what love is. And if we don't get ahead of it and lead the narrative and take charge of this conversation, our children are being taught by the world, and it is not pretty. So this is a very important topic.
Yeah, it's such heavy stuff, Elizabeth, right? To be discussing it. And I think that's part of what makes people so uncomfortable is they don't know how to have a conversation about it. But the reality is, and you can tell by just the conversation that we're having, is you just have to have it. It's not going to be pretty, and it's not going to be an easy conversation, regardless of how or when you bring it up. But there are options, right? As believers, as people who know Christ, there is a way to rewire our brains. There's a way to reverse some of the damage. A lot of the damage you have to learn to cope with and to accept and process and all of that. But there is a way forward in Christ. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your story and the turning point in your story, having been a victim of abuse to now being a survivor and advocate for others who are facing abuse.
Yeah, well, I think Satan's his greatest weapon is secrets. And I think when something like this happens, our go-to is secrets. And what we know now, like Columbia University says, the average person carries 13 secrets at any given time, and 5 of which they've never spoken out loud to another person. And those are usually having to do with sexual things. So for me, I was abused peer on peer. And I think this is important to say. And I like how you said we have to just talk about it, because we have a program called Real Talk for the church that normalizes it. It doesn't make it scary. It just makes it normal conversation. So for me, when I was abused as a kid, the first time was peer on peer by a girl. And what happens when you're that young is it puts confusion. So I was like, oh my gosh, what is that? It sort of felt good. You're a child and things, you have reactions. And so I remember for years, it was a secret. I'm like, am I gay? What does this mean? And now look at how our world is handling everything. If that would have been me today, everything would have been telling me, oh, well, you must be a boy. Like immediately there is a pathway to steal. I kept the secret for years and years and years. And then it led me into another situation because I didn't have a voice. When you keep a secret, you are vulnerable to more. It's almost like you wear a bumper sticker, says victim. And I was abused in the church by a worship leader. And I didn't tell anyone that. That ruined how I felt about myself even more, how I felt about men. I couldn't trust safe uncles anymore. I couldn't trust anybody, but I kept it inside. It led me to like trying to numb, taking on things that would have me black out and not feel. Then I was, raped. And this is where we just have to intervene. If somebody had normalized the conversation about what happens when a friend crosses the line, or, how these feelings come out, it's not scary or weird conversations. They're actually so easily normalized. It would have changed everything for me. I had to fight my way out of serious depression. I became suicidal in my late teens. But for the grace of God, the Lord, kept giving me a little bit, but it was so difficult. And what we have now is like the antidote. What I can tell you is predators are not original. The way they come after our children is textbook. It is 1000% textbook. And we have tools now for parents to make it so easy, for the church, for schools, training for everybody to just, as the church, take the lead. And we have to enter this conversation, lead it, speak to it intelligently, and not as if it's taboo. Because you know what? Your kid's on the school bus every day, and whoever's educating them is not pretending it's taboo. So we need to get in the ring and take this one.
I think one of the scariest parts of this issue is how pervasive it is, and that it's going into the church for so many people. We've reported at CBN statistic after statistic of the number of Christians who are exposed to pornography, which is already alarmingly high, right? The number of even church leaders who are actively using pornography. But I think the thing that bothers me even more is the number of people who don't see an issue with it, who think, well, it's just a victimless thing. Me looking at pornography is not hurting anybody. But as you've talked about, a lot of these things that we learn in pornography are teaching us how to behave, particularly males. They're watching aggressive pornography and they're thinking, well, that's how I should behave
Yeah,
sexually. And then
girls
on the
like
other
that.
end,
Mhm.
women who are being abused think, well, this is what sex is like. So, how can we as Christians step into a culture that's objectifying and sexually abusing and encouraging these things and counter that?
Well, I think it's so important for people to understand the magnitude of the why, because I think, like you said, we talk about it, then no one really does it. We talk about it, no one really wants to enter it. But here's the why. 1 out of 3 little girls today are carrying a secret of childhood sexual abuse. 1 out of 5 little boys. This does not matter what zip code you live in, what country you live in. 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 5. They keep that secret for years and years and years, and it leads to open doors and all kinds of vulnerabilities and all kinds of shame. And then they're exposed to porn by 7 or 8 years old. And as we know, that's rewiring their neural pathways. That's changing how they look at everything. So we're literally grooming children to keep secrets because we're not making it normal to say, hey, are you looking at porn every day? And every boy would be like, yes, and girls are too. Everybody's addicted to it. If we would have the conversation, because what you said is true, it is setting them up. The stats in the church are no different. Like, here's the worst part that I can report is they are the same stats that are in the world. The 70 plus men that are addicted to pornography, the women that are addicted to pornography, the 1 out of 3 that are hiding childhood sexual abuse. The average age someone has abuse, we shared, is 3, 4, 5 years old. The average age people are coming forward, women, 53 years old. Decades of secrets. And what we can say about this is, in the psychology world, we'll say, generational patterns. And in the Bible, it's sins of the father to the 3rd or 4th generation. And what I could tell you is a father or a mother with an addiction to pornography that was birthed typically to like level the shame. Pornography addiction is typically birthed out of abuse or early exposure, which is abuse. And
Yeah.
it just takes the shame away. And if that is the percentages of people addicted to it and they're in the church and they're not healed, they don't even have eyes. They physically and emotionally, mentally, spiritually have blind spots to see the next generation crying out. So we're not even able to be advocates for the generations that we're supposed to be watching over because we are still so full of our own secrets. And we show up in church every Sunday looking great. How are you? I'm great. How are you? And then you go home and the stories that we hear, since I've been running the Foundation United, and we have a program called Real Talk. And even when I was a pastor at Willow Creek, the secrets and the stories. And as the church, like, we need to come a place that we're raw and we're real and we're talking about it because we need to intervene and we have to change what's happening for our children. So for the church to match the world with abortions not confessed, I had one woman come to me who was an elder and she had 7 abortions when she was younger. I had
Wow.
an abortion because I was abused. And then once you were abused, you become promiscuous. And before you know it, you're just covering everything because something in you is screaming, this is not who I am. And you don't know how to get back. And for me, that pathway was difficult, but we have pathways now to make it so much easier. So we have turnkey ways for the church to step into this issue.
There's so much that we could talk about, so many different there are different avenues that you can go down with this issue because it's so I think ingrained in our culture, but it's such an important conversation to have. And before we leave, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your book, Groomed: Overcoming the Messages That Shaped Our Past and Limit Our Future. I think there's so much there even in the title, right? And so many of the things that we talked about just in the last few minutes are addressed in your book, but also a lot more is in the book too. So tell us a little bit about that before we go.
Yeah, well, I would say if you're listening and you're going, oh my gosh, I don't even know what I don't know might be in my past or what generational things I need to look at, it is like a key that unlocks stories and messages that you've come into agreement with that you might not have thought about. And what's fun about the book is that it's not, oh, you must read this to learn about sex trafficking. It's no, you must read this to unveil generational secrets and generational patterns that you might think are benign, but you don't know the damage that they're causing to the next generation or that you're walking under, or things within your own marriage. And it's a beautiful pathway to freedom. And it goes hand in hand. If someone goes to the foundationunited.org, we have programs there. One of them is for the church. It's called Real Talk. And this is part of the guide for walking couples and families. And it's kindergarten through leadership. So Groomed is like a backbone of very softly with a little bit of humor, because this is a heavy, heavy situation, but we make it so that it's palatable. It helps to open up some things that you might have not known are there. And it's a really
Yeah.
great tool.
Well, I think you're exactly right with sin, right? That we think also too. So this is the other thing that I think Satan tricks us into believing, that our sin is just ours and it's not impacting anybody else. But it has a ripple effect. It's like a rock that you drop into water, and the ripples go out and out and out, and everybody that you love is in some way often impacted by our choices and our decisions. So such an important topic. Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking a few minutes. If people want to learn more about your ministry, about your work, about the books that you've written, where can they go?
Yeah, because we have programs they could roll out in their schools, their churches, and it's all at thefoundationunited.org. And you can go to the resources tab or just contact us, and we will set up time to help everybody figure out what they could bring right into their community and right into their home. And there's resources for parents. You could start reading books with your kids as young as 3 years old. Very easy, not scary, but just ways to start the conversation in your home and videos to watch. So love people to check that out.
Awesome. Elizabeth Good, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Take care.